tossers have thrown it out the door with their behaviour this week. They should be ashamed of themselves. They should absolutely look at themselves in the mirror and wonder what the have they been doing. They're hissing at us and calling us cheats in the Lord's long room, and they have the gall to say, talk to us about the spirit of cricket. Absolute bullshit.
There's a big appeal, it's hit him on the pad, he's out! Lions gone, New South Wales are 9 down! Onto Sydney Road, and it hit a car! Oh, I think it's hit a car! What a way to bring up your 50!
All you want is to leave it all behind. Now there is a simple remedy to stay fit for all eternity.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Cricket Unfiltered podcast. I'm Manners, and I've got a special guest today, one of the best cricket journalists going around, and he's always so kind. He never declines an invitation to come on the Cricket Unfiltered podcast. Welcome, Jarrod Kimber. Jarrod, how are you?
I'm great, mate. How are you?
Yeah, really good. And, you know, I've had such a great week because I've been listening to your dulcet tones because I've been listening to the audiobook version of your new book, Art of Batting. So I got to hear your voice over the last week because you actually, you know, read out your own book. Not all authors do that. Why did you do it?
I'd never done it before, mate. And so I wrote a book years ago and I tried to do it myself, but it's very hard to get the pacing right and the editing right and make sure that you haven't misspoken or anything. And when I went back to edit it, I was like, this sounds horrible. And I always thought it was a cool thing to be able to do as a writer is to sit there and just be able to read out your words. And no, I don't even think I have audio copies of any of my other books. And so they asked me and I was like, what do I have to do? And they said, stay in your office for 3 days and speak into a can. I was like, well, I do that every day anyway. Like I might as well get paid for it rather than do it on my own podcast. I had a great producer who kept saying things like, the birds are very loud outside your office. And I was like, yeah, I don't think I can stop them. I'm not sure I can make the birds any more quiet than they are at the moment. But yeah, no, it was really cool. It kind of, you got to remember, this is like months after I've written the book. Yeah. And so going back through it being like, oh, there aren't as many errors as I thought there were, or actually I agree with some of this. This is really good. So no, I really did enjoy it. But just before I went in to record it, I was doing something with Bumble when we do our show together. And I told him, and he's like, oh, don't do that, Jarrod. It's the worst thing in the world. So I'd say, Mendes, it's not for everyone, but I really enjoyed it. And I will do at least one more. Maybe one day I'll get beyond it, but I'll certainly do one more. It's and I think it means more when the writer does it than when a voiceover artist does it.
Absolutely. And with cricket, at least you know the cricketers' names are going to be pronounced correctly, because that can be quite jarring if you're listening to an audiobook and the names are wrong. Anyway, but a beautiful book. Congratulations. Really loved it. You sort of take the reader or listener through a journey of, the great batting of all the eras. And it's, such a beautiful narrative history. I found it captivating. And so congratulations. Well done.
Oh, thanks, man. Yeah, it was, I suppose it's the first time I've kind of written a book where like all my skills came together, if that makes sense. So, obviously I've been an analyst for cricket sites before, but I've also done a lot of historical work and, and these days I don't do a lot of writing anymore, right? Like mostly I'm broadcasting or podcasting or commentating or something like that. And it was great to just go back and write. But yeah, that sort of, I wanted it to be fair from players from every era, right? Like this is the challenge that they went up in this era. This is the challenge they had. Some cases, some batters, they had to do 2 or 3 different challenges, right, throughout their thing. And so, I haven't seen you play cricket, Menace, but chances are you bat at pretty much the same level as W.G. Grace did, right? But in his time, no one was anywhere near that. So you can only be as good as your generation, or as better than you are of people from that era. So you had to be fair to those older players, and also had to be fair to the newer players. Like W.G. Grace didn't have anyone on their hotel bed having a look at every single ball that W.G. Grace had ever faced, right? Whereas Smith and Root and Kohli have to do that. So you want to be fair to the challenges from each player, and so it's a historical look at the different ways that people have made runs throughout the entire history of Test batting.
And I love the way it's written, because it's, that sort of modern narrative style of writing. It really brings the what it really brought to life for me was the romanticism and the mysticism around great batters of any era. And they do have this kind of mystical, they're almost like knights of the realm or something. And you really, you really take the reader through that and all eras, starting with, right at the beginning.
So I remember one of the first interviews I did. So there's a whole generation of cricketers who are sadly passing on, right? And so we've already lost the pre-World War II guys, right? They're gone. Even if you can find some of them alive, man, it's not sure that they could answer questions, in the way that we would want them to be able to. So I was really nervous about getting guys who'd played with and against, Hutton and Barrington and and Dexter and those guys and Garfield Sobers, right? And so I found this old Yorkshire cricketer who played for like 10 years, and he played with Hutton and Boycott. And, so I had all these great stories from 1940s onwards. And then I found this guy who played 10 years for Middlesex and 10 years for Nottingham. And he played, his name was Bob Knockerwhite, just an absolute legend. Sadly, he passed away before the book came out, but just an absolute legend. And he played on field for 20 years, and then he was an umpire for 30 years. So 50 years of his professional life was literally standing on cricket fields, right? Like just a career that almost no one has ever had before. And when I was talking to him about Sobers, as you said, Knights of the Realm, his batting was Sobers. And I think so, he would bat like 1 or 2 spots after Sobers. So Sobers was always in by the time he came to the crease, right? And they had a really good relationship. And he would talk to Sobers about, oh, you did this, why did you do that? And Sobers would give him all the explanations for all the things. And then, and Bob would go out and he'd try and do it, and he'd be bowled. Right. And the next game, you'd be like, well, okay, Gary, what can you help me with here? And Sobers is like, you're moving too early. English players move too early, move too late. Be like, great. Okay. So next time he'd go out and he'd move late and he'd be bowled again. And he'd be like, there's no point talking to this guy. We're different species. We're not, I'm a mammal and he's an alien. Like there's nothing you can get. And that was one of my favorite things in the books was I love talking to Lara and De Villiers and Sangakkara and Dravid. But the great guys were like, Chris Rogers and Jimmy Adams, right? Because they were like, yeah, we were at the other end watching these guys going, we don't understand how they do what they do. And that's when you realize that you can be Ross Taylor and you can have a great international career. And he's looking at Kane Williamson going, oh, yeah, I can't do that.
Yeah, it was. It was brilliant, and I also enjoyed when you sort of sprinkle in elements of your emotional connection to the game and the way a fan feels towards those great batters. Like you sort of are able to draw on that, which is quite a craft. I think Dean Jones, there's bits of it in there, and I think everybody from our era feels like that cruel thing about Dean Jones's Test career being cut short, that there is that emotional residue that a lot of people around our age have, because we grew up, he was our hero, he was the larger than life character in 50 over cricket, and then all of a sudden he's out of the Test side and into the wilderness.
Yeah, I think, I started as someone who wasn't trying to be a cricket writer, right? Like my only writing training is in movies, in scripts, really. And even then, I was only 1 year of film school. And so when I wrote about cricket, it was always the way that me and my friends talked about cricket, right? And so I think there's a big difference between, and I'm not having a go at some of these guys because some of them are absolutely brilliant at what they do, but there's a big difference between sort of a traditional cricket journalist who is a journalist who likes cricket, and probably this newer generation, and there's some of those people from the older generation, someone like Shield Berry would probably be definitely this kind of person, who the cricket is the most important thing, and we're kind of fallen into cricket writing because we love cricket so much. And so when I want you to read this book, you talk about Dean Jones, it might be Navjot Sidhu, right? It might be Roy Fredericks. It could be anyone from any era. I'm writing about them in a way that shows that these guys aren't maybe in the 50 greatest Test batters all time, but what they did and their individual skill set was still absolutely great and should be looked at, because as fans, we loved it, right? Like I think Keith Stackpole, who passed away recently, is mentioned in the book, right? Because he's one of the early adopters of like, I'm going to open the batting and I'm going to whack it. Well, we love that now, right? Like, even, we love the fact that Ben Duckett won't leave a ball. Like, it's captivating watching some, Travis Head or Ben Duckett go out there and play that way. And that's the fan side of us, right? That's why you have your shows. That's why I have all my stuff, right? It's because we're obsessed with the game. And if you take away too much, and especially in a book like this where you're trying to be subjective, right? You're trying to be like, wow, I think you'll find that Andy Flower is, 0.5% better than Inzamam ul Haq, right? Like you get yourself into that, but it's also like, do you know what? Inzamam ul Haq was an absolute god, and it was a pleasure to watch him bat. You have to remember that side of it, because I think every player that I talked about in the book, and it's probably maybe let's say 120 batters come up in the book at various times. In fact, if you can count the women, it might be 145, 150. Right. If you look at that, they all have these different claims and these different quirks, and everyone has a different player that I've mentioned in the book as their favorite player. Right. So when you're writing about them, I want that to come across. I want people to be like, this guy, it was awesome, or this woman was incredible, or this is the person that made me do that. And I think it's a really important thing. And it was probably a period of time when cricket writing kind of forgot about that a little bit, and it probably went back to, what's the news here? What's the narrative here? And it's like, sometimes the narrative is that we love this stupid sport a lot, and that we can't even explain why we like to watch this batter bat. We just do. And there's a visceral thing. And I think I might have even written about it in the book. There was a guy I met. He now runs a cricket club in Kansas, right? But he grew up in Brisbane, and his favorite cricketer was Zahir Abbas. And I've been out to dinner with this guy. I've talked to him many times. He's never really given me a proper reason why. It was just Zahir Abbas had glasses and he had glasses, and he thought Zahir Abbas was cool, and he wanted to be cool, right? And yet he's maintaining this whole career thing of talking about this guy and thinking about this guy. That's what we all have as fans, and sometimes in cricket writing we can forget it. We can forget that sort of stuff. And I think, at its best, a project like this, whether it be your podcast, whether it be my book, it should come from a position of love. Yes, we sometimes rant and we get angry, and yes, there are politics and there is science and there is all these things, but we're all here because there is something that we really like. Like the first memory I ever have of being at a cricket ground, professional cricket ground, watching a game, was a Shield game between New South Wales and Victoria. And the first thing I remember, it's probably not the first ball of the day, but in my mind, it's the first ball of the day, was Mike Whitney storming in. I couldn't wait to see this guy come in and bowl fast, and he fell over on his ass. Like, I don't know, there's something about the sport that isn't just, it's not all, it's not all perfect. Sometimes there are warts there, and you have to enjoy that as well.
I mean, what you sort of put together beautifully is like the story of batting. And I have to say, mainly from, say, post-war, nothing that you wrote jumped out at me as like, oh no, he's got that wrong. And not that I'm a critical person, but you for me, everything felt right the way you weaved everything together. And you speak about Jimmy Adams, and I thought of a player like Aravinda De Silva that got a mention. These sort of players could fade away in the history books, but you document that golden period where Jimmy Adams was the best player in the world for a little while. And then it just went away as quickly as it came. And, you could miss that. And Aravinda De Silva, whose record doesn't look amazing on paper, but what he did for Sri Lanka, was really important. And he was a great Sri Lankan player. And you get that all in there. You stuff it all in and weave it together. And, I really enjoyed it. And
what I didn't want it to be was, these are the 50 greatest batters of all time, and everyone else is crap, right? And I also didn't want it to be, these are the 50 greatest batters of all time, and they're the only ones who had anything to do with it. So Aravinda, I couldn't get hold of Aravinda, but I talked to Kumar Sangakkara, and he couldn't stop talking about it, right? He just couldn't stop talking about Aravinda. And I was lucky enough, really randomly, Jimmy Adams contacted me a while ago to chat about something that I'd written, and we struck up a bit of a friendship. And I contacted him. And when I contacted him, I think he thought, he's writing a book about the great batters. He just wants to talk to me about Lara and Sachin, right? And I'm saying to Jimmy, tell me about Michael Bevan. And what about Ram Prakash? And whatever. And suddenly, like, you can see Jimmy's just like, oh, this is awesome, right? Like, he's trying to get to it. And then I start talking to Jimmy about his own career, right? And he starts to give me stuff. And so all those players matter. And they all play a part in what ends up happening. So even if Aravinda De Silva is not in the two best batters or three best batters probably that Sri Lanka's ever produced, he might be the most important because he's the one that the other three guys grew up watching, right? Roy Fredericks is another player. I was like, would Gordon Greenwich have played with the same freedom, right, if he hadn't have opened the batting with Roy Fredericks and Barry Richards, right? Those are really important players in the history of the game, and Roy Fredericks isn't. So you want to tell the stories of all these different guys, and the people who run between the wickets really well, right? All those sorts of people who help move the game forward. And I think it would be unfair to just be like, well, I can't talk about them. They're the 55th best player of all time. And when we started the book, it was like, I remember talking to Bloomsbury because I thought, you know how these things are. You sell them as I'm going to do a book about the top 50 batters, and in their mind they're like, okay, so he starts at number 50 and he ends up at Bradman, right? That's how they're thinking in their head.
No, just say
And then
that
I said,
just before you go on, the
yeah,
least interesting thing about the book was the top 50 at the end.
yeah, by a mile, right? By a mile, like
everything was way more interesting.
we almost took it out. And we really discussed it, but there's a couple of reasons we left it in. One is that for casual fans, it matters a lot more than it does for us as hardcore cricket fans, right? So casual fans really like this because they don't know much about George Headley, right? Like I did a big a broadcast in the UK the other day, and they'd never heard of George Headley, and they spent 10 minutes on national airways in the UK talking about George Headley because he's a freaking genius. And once you read about him, you can't not be obsessed with him. So that it helped for casual fans. But the other thing I felt that it did menace is there was a couple of players that I thought were brilliant, but it was hard to weave them into any of the other chapters, right? And I didn't want them, like, Weeks and Walcott are perfect examples of this, but there's a couple of other players, I don't think we spoke that much about Clive Lloyd in the main part of the book, but I know Clive Lloyd is great. So what it allowed me to do is it allowed me to still say, okay, so here's Clive Lloyd on the list. Here's why he's on the list. This is why he still matters as a batter, right? Graham Smith is probably another good example of that. So you're right. I think the list is the least important part of the book and the least interesting.
That's a compliment about how good the rest of the book.
No. In my head, though, that's what I was trying to do. As I said, I wrote it in a way that the list could be taken out of the book if it had to be. But I also wanted to honor some of those, because it's great telling a story about Keith Stackpole or Navjot Sidhu or, Bill Brown, right? But you don't want to overlook someone who was the 32nd best batter of all time just because you don't have a good narrative story that fits in the rest of your book. Do you know what I mean? Like, I don't want to overlook these other people that all played a part. So, yeah, I think that's the biggest feedback we've had is that there's only two kinds of people who've read this book so far. People who only read it for the list, and people who are like, if you took this list out, I would love this book just as much as with the list in. And that to me means I probably got it right, and I'm pretty happy with that because that's the big risk. You're telling everyone you're writing a book about the greatest 50 batters, and then you're talking about Aravinda De Silva for 3 pages, and he doesn't make the list, and everyone's like, "Wait, what? Like, how has this happened?"
No, it's fantastic. I've had a great couple of weeks. I had Tim Wigmore on recently, and having read his book about Test cricket, and then you're sort of, lasering in on the art of batting. It was fantastic. So a few things. I know you spoke to Mark Waugh. Is that right? Because we're recording this on Mark and Steve's 60th birthday. And obviously I'm a huge Waugh Brothers fan. They were my heroes growing up and being from New South Wales. What was it like talking to him about the art of batting? Because we hear him on commentary, but he's very laid back. I just wonder what it was like when you got to really probe him.
So I've never met Junior, right? So I don't know him personally, and I've probably written some pretty strident things on his commentary before, and certainly on his selections, right? And you never know. You know how it is in this business. You don't know that someone's ever heard of you until you sometimes approach them to come on something. They're like, "I wouldn't come on that. You said this thing 8 years about me." I'm like, 8 years ago, and you're like, "Did I? Okay, fine." And so occasionally I'd put up a video or an article and he would comment on it on Twitter. And so I just reached out, and you got to think, I think I transcribed about 30 or 35 interviews. I probably talked to about 70 batters, maybe 80 batters over a long period of time. And a lot of my friends who I've known for a very long time were like, "Jarrod, I don't want to do this." Right. And so I reached out to him, and that's exactly what I expected. He's like, "No, I'd love to talk to you about batting." And I think the difference is that he was quite relaxed. It felt like he was going for a walk. He might have even had he's never told me, but he might have had the headphones in while he was playing golf or something. Like it just felt like he was in a really relaxed space. And again, once the guys realized I wanted to talk about batting and not about famous people, they're on side, right? If they think you want to talk about, was Lara a dick? What did you say to Sachin? They just shut down straight away. But when you start to say, okay, so I need to know this, I want to talk to you about, how you conquered the short ball, and I want to talk to you about your brother. And your batting average is, I was quite honest. I was like, your batting average is 42. No one who saw you play thinks your batting average should have been 42. What do you think, right? And it allows him to go into this sort of stuff. And he probably talked about it in a way. It's a shame we did it over the phone, so I can't really release the audio. But I think he did about it in a way that was a little bit more relaxed. And I think it allowed him to think about it. But then he came out with stuff, Menes, that I wouldn't have ever, expected him to say. Like he said to me, Jarrod, when it comes down to it, I couldn't do what Alistair Cook did. Right now, natural talent. And when we're talking about natural talent, it's a bit of a weird one in cricket. But basically, what we mean is how quickly you pick up the ball. Mark Waugh obviously picks up the ball a lot quicker than Alistair Cook does. Like Alistair Cook wouldn't argue that one.
And you can kind of tell with Mark Waugh's catching. That's really where
exactly.
You just see he was quicker than everybody else.
You can see him moving before the ball. Now a lot of fielders do it, but they've had to train themselves to do it. He did that naturally, right? And so he's obviously very naturally talented. And he's saying to me, Jarrod, I couldn't do what Alistair Cook did because I don't have his patience. And it was such a when you got to that conversation, Lara was probably the only guy off the top of my head that never really got to that level. But Rahul Dravid would say things like that all the time. Rahul Dravid talking about Ricky Ponting, you would have thought it was me or you talking about Ricky Ponting. He's like, I don't know how he did this, Jarrod. Like, I tried it. Like, I practiced. I watched how he prepared, and I couldn't do it, right? And Kumar would be like that about Brian Lara, about Aravinda, about Hayden, about Callis, like all these different guys. De Villiers would say this about some other players, right? And that's the bit that I found really great. And so once I found that with Junior, you're just talking about cricket. And it's like, this is what I liked about this player. And when you can work out what players they respect and why they respect, you are allowing them to talk to you, right? So it's not like I tried to talk to him about his brother. It didn't work particularly well. But him talking about Graham Gooch was incredible because they played for years at Essex together. Mm. And he talking about the professionalism of Graham Gooch and, some of the little things that Graham Gooch would do that he picked up on that helped his game. And that is what you're trying to do with those kinds of interviews. You're trying to find what they want to talk about with each individual player and then giving them the time and the space to be able to do that. And eventually, no matter what player you are, you're a fan of someone else, right? Like you are a fan of someone else, either who you grew up with or who you idolized. And I remember, I'm pretty sure AB de Villiers started talking about Yunus Khan unprompted, right? Which is great. At that stage, you're like, I've done something right here. I've allowed them to just tell me different players and what they have taken from different people's games. And so when we were talking to Mark Waugh, that was the sort of thing that happened. We went through, guys like Gooch. He brought up Mark Butcher unprompted, right? And Butch was another guy I talked to for the book. And suddenly I was like, this is great. He's just going through different things. As I ask questions, different things are popping off in his head. And after I did that, I did think to myself that Mark Waugh probably should have his own podcast, right? And should be on a podcast once a week. He probably doesn't want to be, Menes, let's be honest. But I think that kind of thing probably suits him better than commentary, which is a little bit, you and I both done a lot of commentary. It's a little bit more structured and you have to keep an eye on the score and you have to keep an eye on where the ball is and everything else. Yeah, when you are just talking about cricket, the Mark Waugh that you and I grew up watching that knows cricket on a different level than most humans ever came out. And I was lucky enough to be able to get that. And if you'd have told me beforehand I was going to be talking to Mark Waugh, I just wouldn't have thought he was one of the people who would say yes. So sometimes you just get lucky with those guys.
That's fantastic. And I guess to give listeners some context, when Jarrod says he spoke to them about batting, Jarrod went into sort of those sort of pub chats that you have, like, technique versus results or, aggressive batters versus selfish batters and the wobble ball era and all these sort of things that you talk about at the pub about players, about who's the best and, is someone an opening batter or a number three and, is it harder to bat at 3 than 4? And, was it harder to bat in the 90s than the 2000s? And so that's why I think what probably would have resonated really well with the interviewees because it's very pure cricket.
Yeah, you've done this a long time. I remember being lucky enough, and it wasn't that early in my career, but I remember being lucky enough to interview Shane Warne maybe 3 or 4 years after I started my career. So he was retired. He came on Cricket Info and we were like, what do you ask Shane Warne? Everyone's always interviewed him. I think it was me and Bredig. I think we did it together. And the first 5 minutes was, tell us about a batting ball and all that sort of stuff. And you could see eyes glazed over, giving you the same answer he's given everyone else. He's still really good because, Warne was good on that and he knew how to give you the bite and everything. And then we started asking him about, why did you come wide on the crease to this person? How did you set this guy up? Did you change your grip during your career? How did the shoulder injury affect your rotation, everything? And we got to the end of that, and we were only supposed to do 20 minutes, and we were like 35 minutes into this interview. And we were like, we better stop, because otherwise some PA is going to come over and be really upset with us, or, someone's going to tell us we're not allowed to be here anymore. And I remember Warney sort of turning to us and he's like, I just haven't talked about leg spin like that in years. And it was for me, mate, it was a really eye-opener of, if you can get the person to talk about the thing they want to talk about, you will get gold. If you try and keep pushing them into so Mark, why do you think Steve averaged more than you? He's just going to close down. And he's going to be like, I don't know, mate. Like, we're different people. We live different lives. Yeah, we came out of the same womb, but, we're different. But if you get him to be like, so Graham Gooch did this, and what did you notice about Graham Gooch? It's like, how often do people ask Mark Waugh about Graham Gooch, right? And then suddenly it opens back up, and that was the lesson for me, was always trying to find the players that they cared about, right? So I really wanted Ian Chappell to talk about Bob Simpson, but you would know about this, but not all your listeners would know. Not a lot of love between those two men. One was the Establishment man, one was the Kerry Packer man, and they've never really got back together. And you know what Chappelle is like. Once he decides something, that's it, right? I was looking to get around it. So I had to pivot
and Simo's pretty much the same as well.
It would have been the same before I went in the other direction. You're right. So I was like, so after I went to him, I asked him about Roy Fredericks, right? Suddenly I get this 8-minute answer about Roy Fredericks and how he should have averaged about 50 in Test cricket, but he didn't because he had the wrong mindset. But, because he was so good square of the wicket, he couldn't set a field. And suddenly, it comes out. And that, to me, as an interviewer, and I'm lucky I don't do as much radio interviews, TV interviews. So I have a freedom to be like, okay, I've got 20 minutes for this guy. What can I get out? And, there's a certain point in my interview where AB de Villiers literally says something along the lines of, when everything's working for me in my rhythm, like even when Mitchell Johnson's bowling to me, it's like underarms, right? Now, there's no way he's saying that in the first 2 minutes. He's saying that to me because I've asked him about Unistar, right? And I've asked him about, technique and did he think he had a good technique, right? I asked him about how he got better against spin, and then he can go through all these different things of like, this is what I worked on, this is what I took from whatever, and then without thinking, he's accidentally told me this incredible thing of like, I basically could see the ball. I could, he basically admitted to being Neo from the Matrix at that point, right? Like that's what he was saying, and that's what these interviews are. And as you said before, they felt what you felt when you read it, which is, I really want to know how important you think mindset is, right? I really want to know, one of the big things that I don't even think I would have written about going in was motivation. But everyone kept coming up with motivation, and they kept saying, oh, but this guy made runs because of this, right? And then, you pick apart at that a little bit, and they're like, and they would fully explain what they meant by that. And again, it's something that they want to talk about. And from that, it allows you to talk about all these other things. Once you can get someone talking about it, and the thing with famous people is they are mostly asked about what they are famous for, right? They're not actually asked about the craft. And I don't know if I know that you're all over social media, but I don't know if you ever get the same things I get. Is great actors talking about great acting, and then you get actors going on like the Graham Norton show or on your Seth Meyers show or whatever. And on those shows,
the Actor Studio versus the Graham Norton show.
So when they're on the Graham Norton show, they'll tell a great story, right? And you're like, oh, that's really entertaining. And then they talk to other actors or inside the Actor Studio, as you said, or one of those things. And I will sit and watch that for 40 minutes because I'm watching a famous person who I know because they're famous actually talk about craft. And that is what this book is ultimately about. It's about the craft, right? And so once you allow them to know that you're not going to be just asking about their most famous dismissal, right? Or, you're not going to be asking them like, how many women did Lara shag before he went out to make, 200 in this game, right? Once they realize it's like, what made Lara good? What was the technical thing that made him good? Like Jimmy Adams went on for like 15 minutes about how you couldn't set a field to Brian Lara. And he took me through it step by step by step, because he's been waiting for someone to ask him that question for 10 years.
It's true, because actually podcasts and the rise of the internet, which you correctly foreshadowed a long time ago, Jarrod, thought there'd be some future in the internet, and he was right. But there is a bit more room for long form discussion. But a lot of people just aren't interested in the really nitty gritty, and so it gets cut out. And as you say, you're on radio or your commentary, and you get these little bits to talk about.
Yeah.
That's why these books are so important. And then these interviews that you've been able to capture. And I was thinking, and I was sort of talking to New South Wales Cricket about this, that now that it's so easy to record cricketers, we should be recording all of them before they die. Tell me about your career. And it should be, New South Wales should be interviewing everybody while they're still alive and catalogue this stuff, because it doesn't cost much. You can sit down for a couple of hours with someone, and we should sort of be preserving all those stories and their relationship with cricket for future generations. It's never been easier.
I agree. I remember a couple of years ago, the CPL did something brilliant, which is they basically got a company to go out and make about 15 origin stories on sort of younger CPL players, right? And, in the Caribbean, the stories are incredible, and, growing up in rural areas and, not having access and, and I watched most of these things. And I would also watch them on 1950s cricketers, right? And 1960s cricketers and 1970s. And, you end up with the sort of stuff that I wouldn't say that you and I go against because we grew up watching it, but that sort of Doug Walters beer stories, right? And, shenanigans. Some of these guys had to overcome real things, right? And had to live real things. I've been lucky enough, it hasn't come out yet, but I did a documentary on World Series cricket for Channel 9, which I assume will come out next summer now. And you go through some of the stories of these players and what they had to go through, right? Like, one of my favorite things in the book, in the documentary, was comparing the story of the two Marsh brothers, one who becomes a golfer and one who becomes a cricketer, right? And you realize how hard it was for Rod Marsh to be a professional cricketer, despite the fact he was more famous than Graham Marsh, who was the golfer, right? Like, and more important in maybe a more important, a higher ranking and everything else. And these sorts of things, we don't tell those stories as much. We want to tell the stories about Ian Chappell punching Dennis Lilly in the stomach and calling him a medium pacer, right? But the origin story of players is really, really important, and it connects with us on a human level. Right? We all know what it's like to be the person who hasn't made it. And, I've been thinking a lot about Virat Kohli recently. There's a great story of Virat Kohli where in the under-15s cricket, where he wasn't picked for Delhi under-15s. Right? Now, this is the most confident, arrogant guy of all time. What a punch in the gut that must have been to Virat Kohli. Like, is that what turns Virat Kohli into I'm going to show everyone, every time I go out to bat from here on in for the rest of my life, I'm going to show everyone that they were wrong when I was 15. And you start to think of the Michael Jordan stories, and that's the thing I think we've missed at times with cricket, right? And the two things that was always tough with cricket is, if you go back, we wrote beautifully lyrically about cricket, almost this poetry minutes. And it was because the cricket writers were like 80 meters away from the ground. Like, now we have the ability to, I think, still talk about the poetry of cricket and the aesthetics of cricket, but also we can do analysis, we can do technical stuff, right? But we also have to do the story. How did this person get out on the ground at this stage? What were they told along the way, right? And when you actually start to dive into some of these players, it's incredible. And we're talking about more the modern players we know a little bit about. As you said, there's a whole generation of cricketers who are about to pass away, right? That we are going to lose forever. Stick a microphone on them and ask them questions, and you'll be shocked at the sort of things that you hear. And also, what I'll tell you is, as someone who does a lot of sort of historical stuff, you then hear stories about, I think his name is Jack Pollard, the guy in the 1960s who was a Victorian batter who bowled the deuce before anyone else could bowl the deuce, right? And he did it for fun in the nets, right? You hear those stories when you talk to old cricketers, right? Oh yeah, I bowled reverse swing. Like, I had no idea reverse swing was being bowled in Melbourne in the late 1960s, right? You have to talk to these guys, and they'll be like, yeah, we didn't really know how we did it, but it happened occasionally. And then Pakistan got good at it later on, and we'd kind of forgotten about it by that point, right? They all have these stories, and I think it's really important to get to them, because we're all people of cricket, right? And I think sometimes we kind of forget that we need to get to the heart of the game.
Absolutely. I saw Doug Walters a few weeks ago at the New South Wales Cricket Awards, and he was looking really well. He's in his 80s now, but he's still pretty sharp, and he still likes to drink. He's off the smokes now, but yeah, it's great to see him. He's looking really good. So yeah, I mean, I really think that's important to record those stories. Just on the book, like I love the bit about the peak of batters, because that's something, is the peak of Ponting better than the peak of Smiths? And obviously you just take Bradman out because he's peaks above
His whole
everybody.
career is a peak.
Yeah, and then the peak of Richards and the peak of Tendulkar, and the way you sort of break that down. I guess when you sort of went through that, what a couple of the peaks that really stood out to you from a player?
Dravid's was shockingly high. Like because I've never. We talk about Ponting. I think if you follow modern cricket, I think especially if you follow some of my work, you probably know that Ponting had a really high peak, right? And Hashim Amla is probably the one that we talk about a bit, and obviously Virat Kohli is the most recent version of this. I don't remember anyone ever saying that Dravid had this incredible peak where, like, for years he just averaged 70. And Callis is probably the other one. And they're both in a similar era, right? Like, they were right there at the same time. And maybe because Lara was still around and Ponting was in his peak, and you still had Sachin, maybe they just got overlooked. But those were the ones that really stood out to me, where like, oh, okay. And then what we really wanted to do is look at, that's the period when you're supposed to make runs, right? We're between the age of 28 and 32, right? You're supposed to make runs then because your physical gifts haven't gone on the wane and all your mental gifts have come in, right? So, you can see the game in a way that you've never seen it before. And so then it's really interesting to see the guys who were great in their 20s and didn't make any runs at that point. Like, so Mark Taylor is a really, Jimmy Adams, you mentioned before, is another really good example of that. And then you've got the sort of Graham Gooch, Mike Hussey guys, right? Who actually, Gooch was a pretty good player in his 20s. Mike Hussey was dropped by Western Australia in his 20s. And then in their 30s, they're at this different level. And it's really interesting to see that and then start to break it down and wonder what it means, right? Like, was Jimmy Adams just someone who had a great technique, and while no one knew how to bowl to him, he was perfect, and then over time, everyone worked out how to bowl to him and he never came back? Or was it what he talked about, that the sort of mental stress of the game got to him and everything else? And so you go through that. So I think Dravid was the one for me. I was just like, that's incredible. And again, you talk to Dravid, and I think he played for Kent. I think that's right. He played for Kent, and he said to me that it was becoming an adult, right? Like, he lived at home and he'd been looked after, and he wanted to go to Chennai one year, and he got N. Srinivasa to pay him to go to Chennai and play club cricket in Chennai, and everyone had always looked after him, and suddenly he was a Kent on his own, and he's like, oh, I have to be a professional, I have to think about this. And he has an explosion. And Aravinda de Silva weirdly also played for Kent and had the exact same thing happen. And so a lot of it is emotional maturity, right? They understand now that you have to do the thing. So I found that really, really interesting. And then there are other players like, I want to say Joe Root. He never really had that kind of a level of peak. In fact, around 28, 29, 30, he kind of slipped back in the big four a little bit, right? And that was when Virat takes over and Smith is obviously going. So every player has this slightly different pattern, but if you look at the cricketers over the history of cricket, most of the best batters are at their best between the age of 28 and 32. But if you look at average batters, they're usually at their best between the age of 22 and 24. So it does tell you that when we're talking about great players, they are literally a different species to other cricketers.
Yeah, fascinating. Smith's career is going to end pretty soon, his Test career. You outline his peak as being up there with any of the peaks that we've seen.
The non-Bradmans.
Yeah, the non-Bradmans. I think we've been very fortunate.
Yeah, I think the big four was fascinating to write about, mate, because everything was changing, right, while I was writing about it. Like, it was literally, we were in a situation where when I started the book, I was like, I'm going to have Virat too low and everyone's going to savage me. And by the end of writing the book, Indian fans are contacting me going, if Virat's in your book, I won't buy it. Right, like, that's how much the opinion on Virat changed throughout the book. And Joe Root finds an incredible run of form while I'm writing the book, right? And in the middle of, I'm literally writing about Smith while he decides to be an opener. So I still think it's possible that if his body holds up, he's probably the sort of guy who could play for another 3 or 4 years. But what level does he play at? Does he play at averaging 40, which doesn't change his legacy all that much, I don't think. Does he average 45? Which maybe you say to yourself, well, that's a plus player. Maybe he slips a spot higher. Or does he go at another tear? And he's in the middle of a tear at the moment, so who knows what he's about to do at the moment. And if that's the case, he goes back to, I think we thought he had a very good argument to be close to that top 3 level of player when we started writing or coming up with the book, and by the end he'd slipped down a little bit. He could still do that, but yeah, we are very lucky to have 4 players of roughly the same age who are all as good as each other, right? And the 2 guys that when I started the book, they were on the very long list, was Babar Azam and Manas Labuschagne, right? And by the time I started writing, neither of them were even in the conversation, which tells you how great you need to be Williamson, Smith, Coley, and Virat. Even Virat with his slump is still incredible when you go back and look at what he did at his absolute best. And so that just tells you that, as I said before, that there's just a different level that those guys have managed to unlock.
Now, I heard a rumor on Eddie Cowan's podcast today that Steve Smith might be pulling up stumps at the end of the World Test Championship final. And that was a little whisper. Ed didn't claim that it's true, but he just heard that rumor. So let's just see. And that actually wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility. I can see him thinking, I don't want to go to the West Indies. I've won the Ashes before. I've spanked them, 15-0 basically. I can just put the feet up.
I remember writing about AB de Villiers going, he could be our Tom Brady, right? He could be the guy that plays into his 40s because he sees the ball so much better and he's an incredible athlete. And I reckon I wrote that article, Menes, and he'd retired within the month. It goes back to what we were saying before. Do you want to do it, right? And, you look at some of these older players like Yunus Khan, he just kept wanting to do it, right? And we've seen other players who are just like, they get to 32, 33, and they're like, nah. I don't want to do it anymore. I don't have to do it, and I don't want to do it. And so people get really upset when players retire, like something. They're like, "Oh, he could have made more runs, or he could have fought through this slump." And it's like, yeah, it's his life, right? He's got to make the decision on where he wants to go, or she wants to go, or what family life and future job opportunities and everything else. I could see if you told me that Steve Smith played for another 5 years, I'd be like, I could see that because he lives to bat. But if you also told me that he's like, it hurts because my elbow hurts, because my shoulder hurts, my hands hurt because your fingers start to hurt, that ball at 90 miles an hour hits the bat and you feel it, right? You're bent over with your back, all these little things. Eventually you get to it and go, do you know what? I could probably play golf and bet on the horses.
Cricket's tough. And we're running out of time, but when you were talking about past eras, one thing I think that you bring to light is it was actually really tough. Now, they weren't paid a lot. It was a brutal game. There wasn't the protection they have now. And you do describe that. All right. Well, Jarrod, thanks so much for coming on. I could have kept talking for another 2 hours about batting, but I think people should just go and buy the book, The Art of Batting. Where can the listeners keep up with all your work? Because you're doing a lot of great stuff at the moment.
Yeah, I'm always everywhere, as you know that. Goodareas.co is our main website, and from that you can find the audio podcast, the videos that we make, and all the written articles that we put together. But thanks so much for having me on, man. It was a blast.
It was great to talk to you, and congratulations. It's a fantastic book.